Plug. You're muted. You should turn your microphone on.
Hi, hi, Zhao. How are you? This is crazy. The power is going on and off, but I've got to set up on separate power and a separate hotspot, and hopefully it works. But I'm in Accra, Ghana, and it's a crazy. We've had good electricity for the last few weeks, and now literally at 5:17 p.m., 17 minutes past 2 your time, the power went off, and then the Wi-Fi all goes. So for the moment, it's kind of working. It may flash behind me as it comes and goes, but we'll see. And
well, we're pretty used to it, Professor Clark. We're from Global South, so we know that infrastructure sometimes can be an issue. And welcome, Professor.
You have no idea here in Ghana right now. The things are pretty
I think you overreacted here, y'all. We have a very stable connection. You cannot complain about internet in Chile.
Sometimes here where I right now in Valdivia, which is southern Chile, we have a lot of rain here, and sometimes then suddenly a storm could come up and cut down my internet also. So it happened a couple of times, but because we have our very climate different circumstances here in the south of Chile. Yeah, but I'm so glad to be with you connected once again, Professor Clark. You know that meeting we've had, that chat, the conversation, that taxi has actually been changed. That's changed profoundly my subject and my PhD. Actually, I bought the book, James Gardner, which you said right after that conversation, and it shaped many views of mine in my PhD thesis, which I'm now trying to publish. And so thank you so much.
I'm happy it worked.
Yeah, we should try to start on time. We have we are recording this session, Professor Klug. If you are okay with that, I would like to remember that's going to go online. We have social media platforms, and actually I think that it might enhance Global South scholars to access law and society scholarship, to put it on our platforms. So I'm a believer of social media still. So so let's start. We might cut the recording from here. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our fourth session of the Chilean Law and Society Mentoring Program. Thank you for joining us. My name is João Vitor Cardoso, for those of you who might not know who you are talking to. And I'm the organizer of this program, and I have the honor of moderating today's session. Before introducing our speaker, just would like to acknowledge that the support of the Law and Society Association, the sponsor of this project, and the University of Chile, who is our host for this 2024 version of it. And this program aims to create a space for horizontal networks that move both North and South, as we have emphasized throughout. Our goal here is to broaden our understanding of how social legal fields evolve in different contexts by studying different experiences on how social legal scholarship emerges, especially in the global South. And in today's session, we will broaden this vocabulary further by engaging with Professor Hans Klug. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Klug. Klug is a distinguished exemplar of a Global South law and society scholar. What's probably his best known publication is Constituting Democracy, Law, Globalism, and South Africa's Political Reconstruction, which I'm advertising right here, and which is an extraordinary contribution to our field as an attempt to understand whether the Constitution can encourage and make democracy, nothing less. And so it offers a deeply insightful exploration of whether constitutions can foster democracy in the global South, showing how constitutions both reflect a dominant international political culture and yet rely on hybrid forms to address local struggles and conditions. It is a masterpiece that I encourage everyone here to read it. His committed attempt to understand the challenge in constituting democracy in the global South and to question arrogant and often Eurocentric certainties is at the heart of the continuing inspiration of this project as an intellectual network from the global South. So currently, Professor Klug is the John and Ryla Boshard, sorry for my pronunciation maybe, professor of law at the University of Wisconsin Law School. Professor Klug has been a participant in the World Bank mission to South Africa and has been very active in law and development. He's been on the board of Law and Society Association and is an expert in constitution writing, a role that's brought him into lots of debates in Chile in recent years. However, his contributions extend far beyond academia. As an anti-apartheid activist during the 1970s, he spent 11 years in exile, I guess, in Botswana and Angola, before returning to South Africa in 1990 as a member of the ANC Constitution Committee. In Botswana, he set up the Solidarity News Service, a news agency that disseminated critical information from inside South Africa, which bolstered the anti-apartheid movement. And so his political work played a pivotal role in the South African democratic transition in the 90s. And that is why I took the liberty to highlight maybe some features that are not as frequently highlighted as they should to introduce him. So finally, as the organizer, I just would like to say that we're very glad that this group of people is connected hereby to this through this network. And just want to thank the Law and Society Association once again for their support. Now it is my great pleasure to hand the floor to one of the most prominent scholars in the field. For those of us in the Global South engaged in this intellectual movement, Professor Klug's work has profoundly shaped how we think about law, and society. Thank you, Professor Clark. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And can I share? I mean, first of all, this is far too generous. We all make little contributions where we can. And can I share my? Shall I share my slides if I can?
Yes, for sure. Our help desk people could make...
Yes, yes, it looks like I can do that. Does it work? You see it? Oh, what happened? For a second, I thought I saw it.
Let me see.
Do you see it now?
Not yet, not really. I'm gonna...
Okay, let me see if I can share that. Oh, share, hang on. Share. I know it wants to send a copy. I sent you a copy already, right?
Yeah, I can share if you want. Yeah, you should be entitled to do so.
Pardon? I should be, but it's not letting me share. Wow, where are we gone?
Okay, I'm gonna share that then. So just let me find
he's a guest, so you have to right click on the list and make him co-host. Otherwise, he won't be able to share the screen.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
So Joao more, and then put him like co-host.
Yeah, the problem is that we should ask for people in Santiago to make him a co-host.
But no, you are a host. Oh, it's the people in Santiago. You cannot make more co-hosts.
No, I have not. I'm not entitled to do so. So, give me 1 second.
It's okay. No, that's fine. Why don't you just share it, and I'll just say move along when we need to move. Is that okay?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's fine.
Great. So I'm going to do it right now.
I've got it on another screen here as well, so we're fine. Okay. So anyway, what I'm going to do is try and break. I mean, we've got an hour, right? 1 hour or more. How long do we have?
Yeah, we got 1 hour, but we could extend a little bit more.
It's fine. So. No. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk in 2 parts. I'm going to break it up into 2 parts. First, I want to say a little bit about new legal realism and why this idea. And then I will do what I'd promised you to do, which is talk about the research project that I've engaged in over time into access to essential medicines, and explain how that project came about, why I was studying that, what the process was, and how it relates to our ideas of new legal realism, if that is okay. That's the plan. I'm a co-host now, so I should be able to share.
Okay. So you want to share yourself?
Let me try and share. Let's see if it works now that I'm a co-host.
Now that I got things get going, they made you a co-host.
Yeah, that's fine. Where's that gone now? Are you there? Can you see it yet?
Yes.
You can see the screen. You can see the actual screen.
No, not really.
Okay. Oh, okay. Hang on a second. Okay, maybe you should do it because I'm not so competent at this. So why don't you go ahead and do that, and we will work. That'll be better.
I'm going to start sharing again here. So you tell me when I should pass it. So you should see it now.
At the moment, I can't even see you. So let me see where I am. Okay, this is good. So, yeah, let's go. Next one. Right. So, as I said, I'm gonna have the talk in these two parts. First, talk a little bit about new legal realism, and of course, I'm not aware of how much people know either about the ideas of legal realism. You've had lectures on law and society, so I'm not going to have to go into too much detail there. And then once I turn to access to essential medicines, I'm not sure how much people know about the trips and etc. So I'll explain a little, but feel free to interrupt me if you think I'm not giving enough detail. So first of all, let's go to the next one, new legal realism. Why new legal realism? So this is the quote by Elizabeth Mertz. Beth Mertz is one of my colleagues at the University of Wisconsin, and we've been working on this idea of new legal realism for some time. And so the project's goal is to develop, she says, a rigorous, genuinely interdisciplinary approaches to the empirical study of law. Too often, scholars and policymakers have assumed that we can simply pick up the findings of social science and use them in legal settings. The problem with this assumption, she argues, is that basically you are taking all the assumptions from the social science you're picking and you are just importing them into the legal analysis without thinking about the fact that social science itself has very intense debates within any social science about the information that's been produced, the methodologies, etc. And so if you just take the information and dump it in without understanding the background in the particular social science, that is equally you importing things that you don't really want to be importing. So the problem from her perspective is this idea of interdisciplinary translation. Let's move to the next one. So just to situate this, we have a history in jurisprudence going from legal realism, this idea that, the old legal realists started out with, that it's not just law in the books, you've also got to know who the judge is, to law and society, which, you had the meeting with Dave and Rick, and so you have had a deep conversation about the whole idea of law and society, how to study works. Critical legal studies, I don't know if you go into that, but that was a breakaway, as is critical race theory and class crits. These are separate movements, valid in their own time and sense, but different to what we're trying to do with new legal realism. Empirical legal studies is the immediate competitor to new legal realism in the legal academy in the United States. The difference really is that when you think about, the sharing seems to have disappeared, but doesn't matter, I'll carry on. If you think about empirical legal studies, what they're doing is they're limited to quantitative studies. Their concern is very quantitative, and that's fine. They can have that quantitative bias, but we feel that that doesn't bring in the broad enough, the wide enough kind of perspective. So new legal realism is about translating social science into law, but it's about a few other things as well. And let's just turn to William Twining's kind of description. That's the next slide. So William Twining is a British jurist and law professor. And when he talks about new legal realism, he talks about it, he's analyzing what we're doing in the US. And he's saying that one of the strengths it has is that it's not so easy to generalize about it. It's strongly multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. It's sensitive to the different kinds of scholarship and theorizing. Its research agenda is open-ended, although, as he points out, until now, it's mainly concerned with legal phenomena in the US. And I would say that I have a slightly different approach. I'm sorry it's getting so dark around me, but it is getting dark here and the lights are out. So I just will sit in the dark. The top priority of its educational agenda is within US law schools. That's at least where it's come from. I think it has a broader relevance, and that's one of the things that I'm interested in. One of the main concerns is to translate and use findings of empirical research, social science, into the legal academy, into the idea of the study of law, but also doing it through a more sensitive translation. So let's go on to the next slide, where again, you see some of the different people who describe new legal realism, right? The meaning of the law from its impact at the point of delivery, right? Not just in the courtroom, but also in the hallways, the lawyers' offices, even more distant realms, says Lynn Lopaki. You've got Beth Mertz saying, it's always to find successful ways to translate between law and social science. Stuart Macaulay makes the point, and I think it's an important one, that legal rules can be very important, and sometimes they're critically important to how we understand legal systems. So one of the things with law and society and the critical legal theories is they put less emphasis on doctrine. And the argument for new legal realism is that doctrine still matters. The only question is how one interacts, how one watches what has impacts on doctrine. And I'll try to show you in the access to essential medicines conversation exactly how I see doctrine being impacted by other struggles and engagements. William Twining again, the empirical dimensions of law and justice are a necessary part of the enterprise of understanding law. And as I say, social and institutional context is important, but law in the form of legal doctrine matters as well. Okay, next slide. So how does new legal realism affect my own approach to study? So what I'll do is try and present my understanding of the relationship between formal rules and norms adopted at different moments in time and the actual struggles to provide access to essential medicines. And I'm doing it in the context of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So this research of mine started back in the late 1990s through the mid-2000s. And as you can see from one of the handouts that you gave, I was asked to do a recent piece, and that I was very critical about the whole question of philanthropy in this context, but we'll come to that later. So first I'm going to say why access to essential medicines, that's what you just put up. Then I'm going to talk about my actual research and engagement. And third, how this approach has shaped my own understanding of essential access to essential medicines. So let's go to the next slide. So why access, and let's go to the one after that. And why access to essential medicines is I was working in South Africa at the time. I'd returned to South Africa, and I was working in the 1990s inside the democratic transition. I was a young lawyer at the time, and so I, in fact, was the research assistant for the chairperson of the ANC's Constitutional Committee, and I was also on the Land Commission. And at that time, I then started teaching law at the University of Witwatersrand at the same time. But so one back, yeah, that's where we're at. So what had happened was South Africa at the time, in the early 90s and through the mid-90s, was starting to be dramatically impacted by HIV/AIDS. And what you can see in the screen there is that the relationship between what were considered the normal death rate, which is those blue bars, and what was expected would happen as a result of HIV/AIDS. So this dramatic increase in deaths. And so that's what was going on. Next slide, please. And that's between 1990 and 2010. If you take Canada in the same period, 1990 to 1999, you see the death rate going up until 95 into 96, and then it drops dramatically. And of course, we know what happened. That was the introduction of antiretrovirals. And so you can see we're sitting in South Africa, we're looking at this rising death rate, and at the same time, we're seeing that in the north, antiretrovirals has had this dramatic impact. And so that's why I turn and decide access to medicines matters. So the next one, please. So if you look at access to essential medicines, there's your basic map of the world. Africa and Ghana, where I'm sitting right now in the dark, because there's no electricity, less than 50% of the people have access to essential medicines. That's the red blotches. Where you are in Chile, it's between 80 and 95%, which is quite a bit different. But access to essential medicines, as you can see across Africa in particular, but even in Brazil and India and other places, is not as high. And so that's what got my interest. So let's go to the next. Yes, no, the next one. So what has been my process for research? No, don't do that. It's fine. So what has been my process? Oh, actually, that's a good idea. I have got a little lamp. Let me get it. No, I've got. Okay. Thank you. Ah, look at that. Maybe that'll work. Does that help a little bit? Yeah, well, it's just a little bit. It's not like what it was, but there it is. Okay. So basically,
helps a lot, Professor Klug. It's a great exemplar of Global South Society Network.
That's right. Okay. So hang on, one back. So what's been my process? As I was saying, at the time, I was engaged in the land reform process in South Africa, in the political transition. We were arguing for land reform and property, and I was very involved in the constitution making process in the question of property. And what had happened there was that having considered about property, the first thing that happens in 1999 is that property, the first property case that looks like it's coming under the new constitution is when the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association sue Nelson Mandela and the government because there's a possibility of breaking patents in order to address HIV/AIDS. And so what happened then was I decided I had to become involved with this access to medicine issue, not just land, because of property. And this was the property claims of intellectual property. So I'd get involved with a few presentations in 2001. By March 2002, I co-organized a symposium of access to essential medicines in the developing world at the University of Wisconsin with Greg Schaefer. And in that meeting was interesting because people came from Brazil and other places, which at the time were reverse engineering drugs and producing generics, like India was. And so we learned there is another way to do this. But at the same time, with the advent of the World Trade Organization and the TRIPS agreement, this was not going to be possible. There was a problem here. And so I thought, well, I better try and work out what's going on. And I decided to start researching this area. And so I went off to Geneva, Switzerland, which is the home of so many of these international organizations. So firstly, I wanted to know what rules of law in the different international organizations affect access to medicine and how. Second, why was access to essential medicines being framed as an issue of global trade rather than a public health issue? And finally, how did the Doha Declaration on TRIPS, which happened in 2001, come about and what was going on? So next slide, please. So I take myself off to Geneva. And there's the World Health Organization, first place I go to, meet people there. And the constitution of the WHO is that attainment of all peoples the highest possible level of health. Next slide. And so one of the issues is, that one. So one of the issues is if you think about access, if you think about these institutions as institutions, you start with the World Health Organization. It's an institution founded in 1948, 194 member states. But the key points that I learned very quickly is that in its own governance, it has one member, one vote. So each country who's a member has a vote. But they have an ironclad tradition within the WHO of not voting, but deciding as a matter of consensus. And I realized at the time, the reason for this is they're not dominated by lawyers or politicians. they're dominated by the medical profession, who wants to go forward by offering models, so offering ways to do things. And in fact, they have this essential medicines program that started in 1975, and they produce a model list of essential medicines. Again, it's a model that they offer to countries that are member states around the world, and they are prepared to help countries develop their own essential medicines lists. And many countries, including Chile, South Africa, and that now have essential medicines lists. So that's what I learned at the WHO. Next slide. That's the access to essential medicines program, and that has 4 basic principles: rational selection of medicines, affordable prices, sustainable financing, reliable health and supply systems. So that's the WHO's perspective. Next slide. So I also looked at the World Intellectual Property Organization, because after all, the claims that were being made was that this was intellectual property that was being impacted. And of course, that's an organization that starts later than the World Health Organization, 1967. It's established by 1970. It manages all the treaties, including TRIPS. And it is also a one country, one vote, but they do vote. So at the World Trade Organization, if this issue comes, I mean, at the World Intellectual Property Organization, if countries want to raise this issue about intellectual property, they can just, the Global South could outvote the Global North, right? Just because it's one country, one vote. They promote harmonization, etc. That's what they do. Next slide. But then I go along to the World Trade Organization. That, of course, interesting enough, was only formed in 1994 as a result of the Uruguay round of GATT. So between 1982 and 1994, they negotiate. And one of the things that goes on, this has been very well documented, is that the large IP heavy industries in the United States and Europe, pharmaceuticals, film, TV, the arts, etc., get together and push that to the United States Trade Representative and push that intellectual property should be included in the trade negotiations. Until this point, intellectual property was never a matter of trade. It was a matter of each sovereign country deciding for themselves. They could cooperate in the WIPO, but they were sovereign states and they could make decisions about their own. Now, what's really important I learn about the World Trade Organization for our conversation is, number one, when the package was adopted, because Brazil, India, and other countries really objected to the inclusion of intellectual property in the WTO's founding document. But it gets pushed through, and the argument gets made that this is a package deal. So unlike international law generally, which allows a sovereign country, to decide which parts of a treaty it wishes or does not wish to be part of, it can take a reservation on a treaty. When it comes to the World Trade Organization, you're either in or you're out. Right? GATT was nothing like this. So, and of course, this is post-1990. It's at the moment when the kind of hegemon of the United States is hegemonic for that brief moment, the sole hegemon, and they impose this on the world. And so we have a take it or all system, take it or leave it, consensus decision making. So any one country can say no and there can be no change. And it's dominated by trade lawyers, not intellectual property lawyers, not the doctors, but by trade lawyers. Of course, it's also happening in 1994, which is exactly the same moment when South Africa's getting independence, when HIV/AIDS is rampant throughout Africa. So we have this TRIPS agreement on public health and access to medicine. Next slide, please. Essentially, what the TRIPS agreement does, and I'll speed things up a bit. Well, the TRIPS agreement does, it says that intellectual property refers to all categories of intellectual property. So many countries until this point, medicine was separate from regular intellectual property, was given its different status, but TRIPS says no, all intellectual property is the same. Second, that although it says that countries may adopt measures to protect public health and nutrition, in fact, that doesn't get much weight. They do say in 27.1 that patents shall be available for any inventions, whether products or processes. Again, the importance here is that until this point, many developing countries, India specifically, but I believe Brazil as well, did not provide product protection for medicines, only process protection, which of course allowed these countries to take a finished product, reverse engineer it, produce it by a different process, and be able to make it available to people. So next slide, please. Well, so there's discussion about exceptions, etc. But let's go to the next slide. Number 3. But let's jump over TRIPS. Let's hope people know a little bit about TRIPS. So what is it about this international context that I learned in this process? Number one, that pre the TRIPS protection of pharmaceutical patents were a question of national sovereignty. The Paris and Berne Conventions, of course, provided for international protection of intellectual property, but only what countries wished to have or not, where they agreed to be part of it or not. Even WIPO, which was protecting international property internationally, it was only what a sovereign country did or did not accept. The GATT and the Uruguay round, as I've explained, changes all of that. And the WTO and TRIPS from 94 puts it into place. So what about Doha? What happens in Doha? Well, Doha, you get a change. And we can go to the next slide and I can explain that. And the change that happens in Doha is that there's a declaration made at a meeting of the TRIPS Council about agreement on public health. How did this happen? Well, this happens in 2001, late November 2001. And if you remember earlier in 2001, 9/11 happened. And when 9/11 happened in the United States, little packets of a white powder started appearing in the days after 9/11 in Washington, D.C. And they were very concerned about anthrax, that this could possibly be some terrorist with anthrax. Turned out it was some crazy individual, but that's what they thought. And so they wanted access to the medicines for anthrax. And the US government realized that they were available in Canada. And so what they did was they immediately issued a compulsory license for the production of this medicine, Cipro, I think it was, to deal with anthrax, to make sure they had a stockpile. So that was the background. So when we get to Doha, the Global South, South Africa, and was one of the leading players in this, and so was Brazil and India, argued that at least in the context of HIV/AIDS and other diseases, pandemics, at least, health emergencies, there needed to be relaxation of the TRIPS rules. And when the developed countries said, no, we have, you can just follow TRIPS and that's enough, they pointed out what had happened in the United States with compulsory licensing and the drugs for anthrax. And so they backed off and they said, okay, we would allow this TRIPS. They came up with this Doha Agreement. Problem with the Doha Agreement, it tells them that they can use, what the Doha Agreement does is it allows the use of the flexibilities. If you go up another slide, it defines the flexibilities that countries now can use, right? So they can apply customary rules of interpretation. They have a right to grant compulsory licenses and determine on the grounds upon which licenses are granted. They can determine what constitutes a national emergency. And this all sounds good. The only problem is they can only do that domestically. So for the vast majority of developing countries, you can do all of these flexibilities and you can still not get the drugs because you can't produce them. You don't have anybody domestically who can actually produce these drugs. So if you grant a compulsory license domestically, that doesn't do you any good, and particularly at the price. And so it was all very well to get these flexibilities. The question was, how could they work? Now, number D here, the question of exhaustion of intellectual property was a potential game changer, because that said, if the drugs are sold cheaper in India, then you could have those drugs by parallel importation brought into countries, because TRIPS allowed for parallel importation. It did not preclude that. And that seemed to be one possibility. But notice what they also included there: for such exhaustion without challenge, it must be subject to MFN and national treatment provisions, which was also problematic. Next slide, please. So Doha paragraph 6 said that we recognize that WTO members with insufficient or no manufacturing capacities in the pharmaceutical sector may have difficulties using compulsory license, and they called on the Council of TRIPS to find a solution to this problem before the end of 2002. So next slide. We've discussed some of this. Let's go on to the next slide, flexibilities and limitations. Let's go to the next slide. So what happens is, as I said, paragraph 6 calls on parties to find a solution. And what was interesting was, because I'd spent time in Geneva, and particularly at the WHO, and folks there realized what my interests were and what I was doing, they hired me as a temporary advisor to participate in this process. So I got to attend a number of WHO meetings as a so-called temporary advisor for the implementation of the Doha Declaration. The first meeting was at the Rockefeller Foundation in June 2002 in New York. And then they asked me to come to a meeting in Norway at Mosterøy Island, which is a very bizarre place, because it's a place where they have many of these secret international meetings. They put you on a little island in the middle of a fjord with no communication in or out, and they put people together to negotiate. And what was particularly strange was, when I turned up there, I discovered that I was the WHO. There was no other representative of the WHO there. As a temporary advisor, I was sent. And there was the pharmaceutical companies were there, the NGOs were there, the EU, the US countries were there, and now we must negotiate. What was very bizarre about it is the EU and the US basically would come to me and said, if I could get the WHO to agree that we would limit the flexibilities to the 3 diseases, in other words, malaria, TB, and HIV/AIDS, that's fine, but it mustn't go any further. And I said, no, the Doha Agreement actually agrees to all emergency health problems, not just those 3. And so we couldn't come to an agreement on that, but it went further. And so eventually, I ended up at a consultative meeting in Amman, Jordan, and after that at a Ford Foundation meeting, and where it was discussed the whole question of how to make paragraph 6 operational. And what they accepted in the end, if we go to the next slide, right? So if you go to the second line, that just lays out again this process, this transformation over time. So what happens is, in 2001, you get the Doha Agreement. You also get the launching of the Global Fund, right, which is going to become important. And in 2002, they finally put antiretrovirals on the essential medicines list at the WHO. They couldn't put that on beforehand because they were too expensive. And one of the principles for access to essential medicines is that they must be affordable. And so they weren't even on the essential medicines list, even though they were absolutely key to lives. Paragraph 6 agreement in Cancun, they agree that countries can issue compulsory licenses to other countries. So that means a country in the global south could issue a compulsory license in Canada, and Canada could produce the drugs and send them to that country in the global south. What's interesting is they created a complex system of notification to the TRIPS Council, of exactly how much medicine you need for exactly what period of time, for the producer to produce it, et cetera, that I believe only one country has ever tried to use it. Right? So these famous flexibilities that the Doha was supposed to put in place actually come to nothing. And what happens instead is that the turn is, at least in Africa, and that to the Global Fund, and the Americans under George Bush put together the President's Emergency Fund for HIV/AIDS. Now, the key to that fund is it's very effective, right? Within South Africa alone, 471,000 people were put on antiretrovirals in the first 2 years. By 2008, over 2 million South Africans were on antiretrovirals. And today that has continued ever since. But again, I don't want to be cynical, but the truth is, if you look at PEPFAR, now for a while, PEPFAR was providing the compulsory licenses, or not compulsory, there were voluntary licenses by the companies to a South African generic aspirin to produce it in South Africa and sell it to the South African government quite cheaply. So it wasn't just pure gift. Unfortunately, it became clear that it was cheaper to actually still get these medicines on the global market, particularly out of India. And so aspirin got frozen out. And what happens with the PEPFAR resources is that they go to the American companies that are producing the drugs. So yes, the drugs are available in Africa under PEPFAR to a greater extent than before and under the Global Fund. But the fact is the pharmaceutical industry has benefited as a result. This is one of the problems. So eventually the launch of unit aid and the question of the global drug purchasing facility through the Medicines Sans Frontières and others have created this pooled procurement system. That has been the most hopeful development thus far. So today we have this pooled procurement system that's been used, and that is more effective than most things. But it takes a lot of coordination and capacity among health departments in different countries to try and get together a package to ask for to negotiate with a producer to produce a pooled amount for distribution to a number of different countries. It would have been so much easier if compulsory licenses could be granted and it could be done in that way. But that's not what we have. Now, I just want to finish, go to the next slide, but showing you the impact of this process on the very way in which the world thinks about this. So essential medicines initially are thought of as a way to provide cheap medicines to people throughout the world. And what happens is the United Nations in the Millennium Development Goals, Goal 6, talks about combating HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. Why mention HIV and AIDS? Right? And I mean, why mention HIV/AIDS and malaria? Again, the fact that these were mentioned in Doha now becomes the way the world focuses. And if you look at all these development programs all over now, they focus on HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria. Now, these are not good diseases, I agree, and they need to be addressed. But what's interesting is all the other emergency, cancer, etc., that gets all put to the background because the focus has become on these. And then if you go to the next slide, the United Nations Development Goal 8, right, which is part of, so Goal 8, which was the medicines, E, subcategory E says, in cooperation with pharmaceutical companies, provide access to affordable essential medicines in developing countries. Right? Where has the initiative shifted? Even the United Nations is shifting the initiative to working with the global pharmaceutical companies rather than with sovereign governments that need to get access to medicine. Right? This undermining of the Global South's capacity to do it for itself is what this process is about. So let's go to the final one, and then we can open up for questions. So how has a new legal realist approach helped shape my understanding? Well, first of all, in this research, what I learned very quickly is that we need to understand the structure of the international system and the organizations within it. If you
Cannot hear.